Welcome to Forbidden Planet TV, and this is Forbidden Planet TV new releases with my special guest today, VE Victoria Schwab. How are you doing, mate?
I'm doing, as well as can be expected. I've created a little nook for myself. I'm trying to lay down roots, but yeah, I'm good. I'm so happy to be here.
And we're very happy for you to be here. And today we're talking about The Invisible Life of Addie LaRUE, which is Victoria's amazing new book, which we at Forbidden Planet have a great special edition of. In fact, just before the camera started rolling, we were talking about this, but we've had our copies in. They're going to be on sale from the 6th of October. And we've got Forbidden Planet have got a wonderful blue foil cover edition of the book, which has got these beautiful blue foil highlights on the cover. And we've also got, it's also signed by Victoria, and an exclusive short story, The Ghost in the Frame.
Yeah.
Thank you very much for doing that for us.
It's my pleasure. I just can't wait to see the finished product.
Oh yeah. Well, we can't wait to get it out to you. I mean, the book is such a wonderful, fascinating, time-spanning concept that you described to me the last time we spoke as an inverted Peter Pan. Could you just talk a bit about the overall direction of the book and what that description actually means?
Of course, yeah. So a lot of times people will ask authors like, "Oh, where do your ideas come from?" And that's a very generic concept, and it also creates this concept that the idea is a single thing. But for me, I find that my ideas for stories are more like ingredients in a meal. They come together slowly and over time, and Addie was no exception. Addie took almost 10 years, and part of the reason was my own insecurity, and the other part was that there were a lot of elements, and I was asking a lot of questions, and I wasn't quite sure how I wanted to answer it. But at the core of it, the ingredients at the core of the meal that make Addie is a concept of what is time and what is memory, and how do we leave marks on the world. And I had studied Peter Pan in school, in a children's literature course, and I had been amazed by how sad it was as a story. You know, by the time the story's ending, Peter Pan is sitting on a rock and he's already forgetting that it had happened. And that did seem sad, but at the same time, I was losing my grandmother to dementia.
Yeah, okay.
And I was watching her forget my mother. And the pain that my mom experienced being forgotten was so much more acute than anything I had ever seen before. And I started to think about what it would mean and how would you move through the world if you were forgotten. In what ways would you be a ghost? In what ways would you be real? And for a long time, I had been mulling over this idea of wanting to tell an immortality tale and a deal with the devil tale. And I started to think, what would immortality look like if you were an inverted Peter Pan, if you remembered everything and nobody remembered you? And not just that, but what kind of personality would it take to not only survive, but thrive in this environment, in this situation that would break so many? And so that was really the heart at the beginning of Addie LaRUE, is what kind of young woman would make this world hers, would find a way to leave her mark and carve her way through and kind of test the boundaries of her curse instead of just giving up like the devil wants her to.
Yeah. And you just mentioned the 10 years it took you to write. So to roll back to the beginning of that process, I seem to recall from our last conversation that some of the genesis of writing the novel was kind of vested in Liverpool, which is my hometown, and also Britain's Lake District, which, because I grew up in Liverpool, I've spent many weeks of my life walking around.
Yeah.
Could you just elaborate on that a bit?
I didn't have the best experience in Liverpool, and it wasn't a reflection on Liverpool at all. I was 23 and I had moved there temporarily to work on a book because I could either sit at home and stare out my window or I could sit somewhere else. A friend convinced me to go to Liverpool, and through a series of unfortunate events, I ended up living in an ex-prison warden's garden shed.
Wow.
In L18 in the Liverpool suburbs.
Yes, yeah.
In the dead of winter, and it was fairly lonely and fairly miserable. And so because of that, and one of my housemates, people who actually got to live in the house as compared to the garden shed, had offered to start kind of dropping me off on her way to places. She was traveling around the UK for work, stylizing like shoe displays. It was a very specific job, but it required her to drive everywhere. And so she started just dropping me in random towns for the day. And one day she dropped me in the Lake District, and she dropped me in a small town called Ambleside. And I had 8 hours to myself, and I got an order of fish and chips, and I just started hiking. And soon I found myself in the hills surrounding Ambleside, completely alone on kind of a rainy day. I had just climbed to the very, very top of probably a property that I shouldn't have been on in retrospect, but there's that open hiker's law. And
Yeah.
I found myself just completely alone, overlooking this massive vista. And in that moment, I just started wondering, what would it be like if there was no sense of past, present, or future? What would it feel like to be immortal? Because in that moment, I was just very tired.
Yeah.
And I just kept thinking about the fact that when we have immortality tales, there's always this component of ennui and fatigue. And so that's really what I started to think about, is like, what would it feel like if life felt like climbing this hill right here and there was just no end in sight? And so it's interesting because over the course of creating Addie, it really changed away from this sense of fatigue to what kind of person would not feel that fatigue. And that's why Addie became this intensely, stubbornly hopeful person. And there's a thread in the book where she says one time, I saw an elephant in Paris. And that becomes this recurring thread where whenever somebody's trying to wear her down, she recalls this concept of like, she has no idea what she's going to discover tomorrow, because no matter how long she lives, there's always something new to discover. And she holds on to that, having seen some of the best and worst of humanity throughout the century. She's just always holding on to this concept that as long as you live, you don't see everything.
Yeah. I think it's a fascinating metaphor for those wars that go on in our own human minds every day, you know, and that those shifts in our emotions as we're perceiving and realizing the world on a daily basis.
Yeah.
And I think it's such a lovely sort of extended rumination on all of that. So Addie herself is a muse, yeah. What are your feelings on that role, and you know, your thoughts about the creative process itself?
Yeah. Well, I tend to be fairly controlling. I always say that authors are a bit like tiny gods. Like, we tend to be in control of our worlds. And I'm definitely not the kind of writer who usually just wanders in the waste of my own ideas, trusting that someone will guide me. But I am fascinated by the personification of ideas, whether it's death, whether it's, war, whether it's muses. And muses are one of those classic personifications. And I had read, a couple years after I first started germinating, I had read Elizabeth Gilbert's book, Big Magic. And she talks about ideas as a personification. She talks about this idea that she had a story idea that she neglected, and so it chose somebody else. It chose Ann Patchett. And I was fascinated by this concept, but I was also fascinated by the idea that when we talk about inspiration, oftentimes we as creators can't pinpoint the source, which made Addie a fabulous conduit for inspiration, because you never remember Addie, but what she discovers is that ideas are wilder than memories. And even if you don't remember her, she can kind of plant the idea, and then in the absence of the memory of her, the creative begins to think it's themselves. Yeah. And so she doesn't get to take credit for anything, but she absolutely gets to influence art. And I also wanted to make her a muse because the devil is a patron of the arts. Yeah. And I wanted them to kind of almost have competing functions here. She and the devil both foster art in their own way.
Yeah, that's very interesting. I guess the beauty is that the ideas that she has created, that she has incepted, they live on, you know, and you know, they become that sort of undying presence in everyone.
Well, and isn't that immortality, right?
Yes,
for the
absolutely.
majority of us, we ourselves won't be able to leave any marks that are us shaped, but we can hope to influence something around us in the world, and that's the piece that carries forward.
Yeah, and I think that's why creators, particularly in our human society, probably come the closest to creating a kind of a real, you know, whatever the most real iteration of immortality is. That's what it is. You know, it is creativity. It is creators. Maybe fantastic sports people to a degree, you know, but really, it's not a very common thing to be able to do. And I think one of the great one of the great upsides to having a calling like the one that you have, you know, that parallel to me is very interesting.
Oh yeah, and I think, I mean, I engage with this concept of, maybe if I'm lucky, something that I create will outlive me, but my presence in that project is negligible, right? People hardly ever think about the creator once they consume the art, and that's fine. That's how it should be. And so it's a really interesting concept to engage. So much of the writing of Addie LaRue was about engaging and kind of internalizing and self-examining these concepts in my own life, as I think we do all the time with creativity.
Yes, yeah. Well said. What's it? What was it like? The 300-year span of the novel, right? What was it like coming to terms with those 300 years, and what you chose to involve and not involve in that? I imagine that was a fairly complex process.
It was daunting, yeah.
Yeah,
Because what I discovered nothing happened quickly. I almost said what I discovered very quickly, but nothing about this process was quick. What I discovered though is that I had to create some constructs. I had to create some rules, or else, it would become a travelogue. It would just become Addie through the ages, just hanging out in Tokyo, Mexico City, Prague, wherever she wanted to be. And that's great. And I tried to create a sense that, what we see, the portions of her 300 years that we see, are only the tip of the iceberg for her.
yeah,
I can only capture, maybe a dozen, 2 dozen moments. But I traveled to every single place that I wrote about over the course of the 6-7 years before I started drafting it. I
yeah,
was constantly looking for, as an author, I had this privilege that I was traveling for work. And so when I would reach a city to promote, I would look around and think, if I only had a paragraph to capture this city, what would I pick? Like, what would the descriptors be? Because essentially I never got to spend more than a single scene in any of the places that Addie goes through time, because it would have unbalanced the book. And so it really became an exercise in like close reading on a city and trying to pick out those little tiny aspects that a local would notice if they weren't there,
yeah,
if that makes sense. But I had to pick. And in the end, I made Addie quite a Francophile, because I
yeah,
wanted her to have an allegiance to her country and to her identity. And when she makes the deal with the devil to live forever, it's not so she can travel the world. She just wants time. And she's actually, because of some aspects of her curse and some aspects of her personality, she's quite a hedonist. Like, she likes art and culture. She likes feeling comfortable, because she very rarely gets to feel comfortable. She can't really hold on to anything. And so I really kind of centered her still in Europe and then in America, because I had to look at ways that she could travel. And she could only travel via stowing away, because she has no identification. She has no
yeah,
paper. She has no anything. And so I combined her own personality as like a Francophile and a French woman, her travel paths that she could take, and where she would want to go as a
yeah,
young woman in these time periods. And so I use that to kind of guide, and then history, and the history that I wanted her to impact. And so I use those to try and create some boundaries. But I could have written another dozen scenes just of Addie traveling through time, because I had done all of this work to understand where she would go.
yes, of course. Of course. Would you ever? I mean, I guess it's what you've done with the additional content in the FP edition. I mean, there must be
Yeah.
so many things that if you wanted to, you could
Yeah.
just spin out and tell those stories.
I mean, maybe I will one day. I don't know. There's a few cities I didn't get to write about that I had really been looking forward to. And they just, we're still trying to tell a good story, a good
Yeah.
book. And to do that, you have to balance her 300 years as being counterbalanced with her 1 year in New York City.
Yes.
And so in the end, you make cuts, but
Yeah.
I would love to write a couple more of Addie's flashbacks.
Oh, yeah. And what would be at the top of your list of places that
I never got
you'd
to write
like?
her in Prague, and I
Ah,
went
yeah.
to
Right.
Prague early on in my research trips
Yeah.
for her, and I had one of those like very strange, unique experiences that would go on to inform so much of Addie, but never made it onto the page, in this tiny little church in Prague, like a gold-lined church, where my mother and I went, and we just stumbled upon like an orchestral moment that was happening
Yeah.
there, where they were playing classical music to basically an empty
How
church, and
lovely.
they gave you blankets when you came in, because the church was very cold. And I just remember walking the streets of Prague when I went there for the very first time, and noticing that almost all of the sidewalks have a patterned tile. And it's something I had never seen in any other city at that point in my travels, but just this almost black and white patterned tile that had been mosaicked across the city. And there was so much care and detail in that. And I thought, if you were to write about Prague and not mention this, someone would guess that you had never been to Prague.
Yeah.
You know, it was just one of those things that you couldn't not notice. And so that, and this tiny little chapel, and, you know, I would go on to put her scene with the devil in the church, which was one of my favorite scenes in the book, in a different church in a different country. But that church in Prague was the one that inspired the moment in the book where she is talking to the devil in a church about God.
Ah, lovely. Okay, I can see that, and kind of making me wish you had written it now.
I know.
Yeah. And to talk about, can you flesh out Addie's relationship with Luke for a bit for us?
Yeah, I wanted to,
without spoiling things, you know.
Yeah, so Luke is what we call the devil, but it's not actually the devil. The devil is a new word for an old idea. So essentially Luke is a God of promise. He is an old God. He is the God of darkness, and, you know, existed before Christianity, and now Christianity has given him different terms that he doesn't really care about. But the thing about Addie and Luke's relationship is that it's essentially an abusive relationship, but it is very much a relationship. It is something, because for the majority of those 300 years, he's the only person, we'll call him a person, he's the only person who remembers her name. He's the only one who recalls her at all. And he becomes the only constant in her life, and she becomes the only constant in his life. And so what happens is this, almost the 5 stages of grief, but for their relationship, this sliding from antagonism, well, real just outright loathing, to antagonism, to a slight camaraderie, to romance, and then through that to the other side, the inevitable shattering of that over the course of these 300 years. And my favorite detail about him is that his appearance, when she summoned him, she didn't know what she believed in. And the devil takes the shape of something that you believe in. And the only thing she knew she believed in was finding the love of her life one day. And she had drawn the love of her life since she was a child. And because that was the only thing she truly believed in, was that it was worth waiting to find love, Luke took on that aspect. He took on the aspect of this young man that she had fantasized about. And so it really becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy over the course of the story that she does fall for him, and for people that look like him, because that's, you know, her concept of his aesthetic existed before his actualization of that aesthetic. But yeah, I have never had so much fun writing a person as I did, or writing in a relationship really, as I did writing Addie and Luke together.
I think it really shows, and I can't wait for the people watching this interview to read the book. And speaking, using the term book there, another great location within the novel is a used bookstore in New York. And given that we're talking about this for a bookstore, Forbidden Planet, could you just close out on your relationship, the relationship we all have in different ways with you know, booksellers, and what that means to you?
I mean, if I were to design heaven, it would be a bookstore, right? Like, that's just,
right on.
It's my happiest place in the world. If I'm in a city and I only have a day, I find a bookstore. Even if I don't speak the language of the city that I'm in, I find a bookstore. There is something deeply comforting about being so close to so much story. It's this idea that you could pick something off the page, off the shelf at random, and you'd be set. You could go in with an intent and you could be set. Like, the thing I miss most about travel right now is the ability to just peruse and discover entire worlds that way. And so obviously, as an author, I have a very close relationship to bookstores, but far before I was ever a writer, and even still now, my love of bookstores is as a reader. There's always a nerve-wracking experience of going into a bookstore as an author, because you're like, are they going to have my book?
Yeah,
like, what if they do have my book? What if they don't have my book? But if I go in as a reader, I'm just thinking, what am I going to read? What am I going to discover here? I mean, there is nothing closer to a portal, I think, than the doors of a bookstore.
Yeah, that was brilliantly put. And on that brilliantly put note, you have been watching Forbidden Planet TV new releases with the spectacularly talented Victoria Schwab. We have been talking about Victoria's new novel, The Invisible Life of Addie LaRUe, which is available. Our special edition at Forbidden Planet is available from the links attached to this interview. Thanks so much for preparing that version for us. It's signed by yourself and it's wonderful. And everybody who buys this book is in for such a real treat. Thanks for carving out the time of your day to speak to us, Victoria.
Thank you so much, Andrew.
Take care. All the best. Thank you.